Welcome to Kaiser Watch with John Kaiser. I'm your host, Jim Goddard. Welcome to the show, John.
Jim, glad to be back on the show.
What's coming up today?
Well, today's going to be a brief show. I have two topics. One is what happened to FPX Nickel, which I think has the potential to become an international scandal story. And the other is an update on what's going on in the James Bay region.
Why did FPX Nickel drop sharply on Wednesday?
On Wednesday, the company put out a press release acknowledging that the Galaxy-Cyr nation, with whom they've had a memorandum of understanding since 2012 and with whom they have been working since 2009, had in its August monthly newsletter published a full-page declaration unilaterally withdrawing from the MOU and unequivocally declaring that they do not want a mine within their traditional territory. Now, once the market read this press release, they said, oh no, here we go again. And amongst my subscribers, some of them who are Europeans and have been burned by the Moose Cree First Nation with Niobe Metals and its James Bay niobium project, they just threw in the towel, dumped the stock, and said, Canada is a disaster. Canada, you cannot trust the mineral system. The country is running a fraud with its mineral title system that encourages companies to spend money staking claims, spend money exploring stuff. But at the same time, we have this unsettled land claim by Canada's First Nations, not just for all of Canada, the second largest country in the world, but because all these different First Nation groups are themselves competitors with each other with overlapping land claims, they claim 400% of Canada as that to which they are entitled to because they were here before the Europeans came. So you have this nightmare where everybody, the 37 million Canadians who are not full status First Nations, they assume Canada is this big, giant, wonderful country whose benefits are for the benefit of everybody. And then you have this class, this race-based class of 1 million people who almost like an aristocracy claim, no, this is actually all ours and you are here only at our behest. And in fact, when I dug down further into what was going on there with the Galaxy-Cyr nation and FPX Nickel, if you read the FPX news release carefully, you'll notice that there is another agreement in existence with the Vinci Wuten nation. And it turns out that back in the 50s, the government administrators who took care of what was then called, I think, Indian affairs, they to simplify their life, they arbitrarily clumped two distinct groups that have their own traditions and, of course, overlapping claims into one group that they call the Galaxy-Cyr nations. And in 2019, the Vinci group finally separated from the Galaxy-Cyr group. And in 2022, FPX Nickel said, okay, the government encouraged us to do a deal with every single competing group that's in our area, even though none of them actually have contractual rights to anything, and none of these deals are binding, at least not on the First Nation side. They can opt out anytime they want, whereas the companies, of course, they could opt out also, but then they would die in the court of public opinion. So generally, when they do a good faith deal with the First Nations groups, they honor it, do it their best. If the First Nations are unhappy about something, they do what they can to get this fixed up. So when you dig down deep enough here, you realize that there is some sort of power struggle going on between two First Nations groups. And one of the group is still happy with this agreement. They would like to see a mine in the backyard. It's only going to be a pinprick in this vast, huge territory called this traditional territory. And in fact, if you go to their website, you'll even see that FPX Nickel, along with a bunch of other companies, were sponsors of the recent fishing derby. So there's this problem here where one group has suddenly unilaterally said, all of this land is sacred, even though when you look at Google Earth and look at this area, at the footprint of the traditional territory, it is a patchwork of clear-cut logging which has desecrated the landscape. And you go to their website and you see that they have a special timber division where they make money from desecrating their sacred traditional territory. So you think, okay, what is going on here? One group is happy with this relationship with FPX Nickel. And by the way, we're still awaiting the pre-feasibility study. I mean, there is a risk that come September, this project is marginal. In fact, if the nickel price goes low enough, which it could because Indonesia is flooding the world with dirty nickel, and a lot of people don't seem to care that the raw material inputs are done in horrible jurisdictions with huge carbon footprints. This project has the potential to be very different, a source of clean nickel, which is why Outokumpu is an investor, and that feeds the electric vehicle market in a jurisdiction that is secure, and you don't have to rely on Russia and Indonesia, which is now in China's orbit, and you have the global West versus global East conflict going on. What's happened here, it has the potential to become an international spectacle because Canada is, as the second largest nation in the world, it has vast resources that have not been truly explored and exploited. And if this East-West conflict continues to escalate, which it probably will because China's economy keeps deteriorating, and what do you do when you're in a free-fall economy and you've got your own people all angry because you're a big authoritarian thug government? Well, you're going to have to escalate conflicts with another enemy. So this is going to get a lot of attention. We have the Quebec lithium potential, the James Bay district. All of that is also First Nation territory. And if it becomes clear that any group within these overlapping competing groups can suddenly declare this is sacred, we oppose it, and therefore, because Canada is a signatory to the United Nations Indigenous Rights Declaration, you can't do anything. This is not going to, if this becomes a global spectacle, it will not end well for the First Nations because you're going to have the 37 million Canadians who are not full status Indigenous people. They're going to stand up and say, what is going on here? And there will be a resentment backlash, which will erode the sympathy that Canadians currently feel for the plight of the First Nations in the past couple hundred years where they were just pushed aside and ignored and not respected in any way. And the government's problem right now is that they have failed to actually sit down and make a serious take it or leave it offer. They tell the companies, go do these little deals and all that, and then they pussyfoot around and make noises about how sympathetic they are, but to the plight of the First Nations. And the First Nations, frustrated by this lack of action, have escalated their demands to the point where they are becoming out of control and in danger of threatening their own backlash. So the stock sold off. My European subscribers, they were particularly unhappy. They said, why didn't you warn us that there is First Nations risk? Well, everybody knows that Canada has First Nations risk. First Nations have the potential to disrupt and destroy any mining exploration project. And that really has to end. And there are some jurisdictions where the First Nations, they figured out how to become part of the economy, that they're not in the orbit of these anti-mining NGOs who feed them all the stuff that you need to turn this into a giant wilderness park and then zoom around in your snowmobiles and all-terrain vehicles and power boats and use modern technology to engage in traditional hunting and trapping methods. These other groups, they work with everybody, they do deals, they get a piece of the action, and their communities flourish, whereas others sit there and don't want to really participate in a modern economy. So right now, FPX Nickel is behind the scenes in confidential discussions, can't tell us what's really going on. We can only guess. Their hope is that they can get a resolution to this. They were blindsided by this. They did not realize that there was a breakdown, that a faction had emerged. And again, it's one tribal council of 8-10 people and a chief who suddenly make this decision on behalf of all their people in an overlapping jurisdiction where another tribal council and chief are actually in favor of seeing this go forward. Hopefully this gets resolved quickly. And the big mystery investor, which is probably international, and Outokumpu, which is a Finnish company, they've put almost $30 million into this company in the past year on the expectation that this is a legitimate, different type of project which will approach carbon neutrality and which has a kind of tailings in that which doesn't at all ruin the environment because it is an inert material. There's no acid drainage problem or anything like that. So I think once people realize that the Klaxon Nation cannot really stop this, it can say what it wants, they'll go back in and start buying the stock, but this will force the Canadian government to come to terms because it recognizes Canada's important role going forward, not just critical minerals, but the supply of all minerals if the geopolitical conflict between East and West escalates and gets worse. There's a lot of raw materials that are not going to come to Western democracies. They're going to have to be developed in places like Canada. And having this First Nations arbitrary ability to just declare something sacred, even though it's completely hypocritical, that's not going to be able to stand. So I think this will actually force the issue, and it'll head off a similar wave of extortion in the Quebec region, where Canada is going to become a major source of lithium supply in the future.
Any new developments in the James Bay region?
Well, we don't have any really good news yet on the and the forest fire access bans, the western part. It's still a fire mess. Indigenous communities, they're suffering as a consequence of this. All the resources went to southern Quebec earlier in June, and they let the north burn, and now they have really big fires that are threatening everything. And out there, it's mainly either people who service the infrastructure, the hydro infrastructure in various exploration camps. And a lot of those are Indigenous people involved in this. And all of them are now being impacted by these out-of-control forest fires in the western part. Now, rains are moving into the whole James Bay region, but it will still be a while before it has properly soaked everything and helped put out these fires that they're struggling to contain right now. The roads are still closed. In the eastern part, yeah, there is access. You go from Renard Mine up to the Mirage Camp. That area is open, and some companies are deploying boots onto the ground in the eastern part. But in the western part, that's all still shut down. And the big news that came out this week, in fact, today, was Allkem announced a resource update for its Cyr Galaxy James Bay project, where they reported in a total measured, indicated, and inferred resource of 110.2 million tons of 1.3% lithium oxide. That's 173% increase from before. They obviously did a lot of drilling in the eastern part, approaching a Brunswick Anatakal West project, and we're able to fill in that part. But the big surprise was the northwest sector, for which they reported 30.7 million tons of 1.42% lithium oxide. And we could tell from the results that they reported earlier that where this system of series of on-echelon pegmatite dikes, typically 300-400 meters long within this multi-kilometer long trend. It bends to the northwest and disappears underground, was missed by the earlier explorers. It's still open along strike and at depth. So the grade is only like 0.1% lower than 109.2 million tons of 1.4% that Patriot Battery reported last week for its Corvette project, the CV5 pegmatite. And this project's much more advanced. It's already at the sort of feasibility stage, prepare for permitting. So again, further evidence that the James Bay region, not just north, but also south, has world-class deposits of lithium at a grade that can survive a price decline, into the $5 to $10 per pound range. In the past week or so, the lithium carbonate price has started to drift lower, and but that is to be expected, and especially with China's slowdown. China's slowdown is starting to really cause a lot of concern out there. We're seeing it in weakness in the metal prices. China's post-COVID rebound has not happened. Its reliance on debt to build infrastructure, not just productive infrastructure, but real estate infrastructure during the past decade, it is now coming to haunt them. Their authoritarian wet blanket that they have put on the people. People are afraid. They're not spending money. China knows it needs to switch to a consumer-based economy, but the people, they're balking. After being forced to do nothing for several years under the strict zero COVID policy that at the end of the day failed, now they're just holding their heads down and saving their money and not spending. And this is a problem for China. It's a problem for the resource sector. On the other hand, if China starts to fail, then all these predictions of shortages for key energy transition metals, those will be ameliorated. Maybe we don't need a 50% expansion in copper supply to make all these electric vehicles happen. So there may be a bright side for the some of the metal supply problems related to the energy transition if China fails. But again, China is going to bite the bullet. It's going to figure out how to get this going again, hopefully not by escalating the conflict with the United States. At the moment, the signs of it not escalating, well, it's going in the opposite direction. And we're also seeing the situation in Ukraine. Ukraine is getting more desperate. This is going to become much hotter. It's going to pull the United States into it. The Niger coup, the Russians are behind that coup. They're in there gaining control of the whole Sahel, and the French have been kicked out, and the so-called West African consortium, they're not really in a position to do anything. Putin is winning the war against the West. The West isn't ready to do what it takes to secure Ukraine. All of this bodes very poorly for the future. But again, if this does escalate, Canada becomes so important as an alternative supplier of raw materials. And as with the earlier question, resolving the situation with the First Nations, making them part of the solution rather than the part of the problem, make it a win-win thing. This has to happen right now. You need to stop pussyfooting around, get a deal done, treat everybody with respect, and stop all this nonsense of extortion as, allowing something like it's really operating like some shopkeeper who has to pay protection to different competing street gangs who are going to protect the shopkeeper from each other. This is a joke. This should not be the case. There should be a system whereby all these claims get resolved and a fair share of the productive production created by these mines is handed over to the First Nations group so that they can flourish and build their own economies and cultures. This needs to happen now. None of this just pretending to do something while doing nothing. This has to change right now. And I do think the James Bay area will come to life. I've put everything together to launch a James Bay Lithium Index for next week. This past week, the Junior Explorer, an influencer, put out a great 1-hour interview with Killian from Brunswick Exploration, which really nicely explains the whole context, why Quebec's going to be so important, why even perhaps all of Canada can become very, very important as a lithium supplier. People should grab a cold one or a tea or coffee, sit back, and just listen to this or watch it on their desktop, laptop, or iPhone, and just digest the message of how this Lithium Mania 2.0 boom is set to really take off in the fall when the fires are finally gone and they have a 2-month window to go in there, surgical precision, check out all these targets they've identified from the satellite imagery and generate drill targets maybe some for still in November, but most of them in the first quarter of next year, where when snow covers everything, you can't look for targets. You need to know where they are. I think we're going to see a lift off in September when the fires are gone and access is available and the summer doldrums from the market have come to an end.
John, thank you so much for the update.
You're welcome, Jim.
We've been speaking with John Kaiser. I'm Jim Goddard. Comments made on Kaiser Watch are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any manner whatsoever as a recommendation to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Archived online at kaiserresearch.com.